Coney Island, a land of many different mysteries that go all the way back to, you'll never guess it, the 1800s. And we can see now that it's beset by modern functional architecture. But if you get on a subway in New York and you're on your way to Coney Island, you may come across some of these mysteries. For example, the geographical position of Coney Island, which just happens to be located right in the narrows between Upper and Lower New York Bay. Whatever name we're referring to the bay by, though, it's very intriguing to think that Coney Island happens to be at the main point of entry. And we understand that New York City was the first true megalopolis in the United States. And here you can see the exact position of Coney Island right before the narrows between Upper New York Bay and Lower New York Bay. So you can see it would be the main point of access. But there's many mysteries, such as these incredible amusement parks and very unique architecture. Was it temporary architecture? Or was there something more applicable about this Dragon Gorge area? And who is this real estate developer who tried to save Steeplechase Park? And is this actually a Stargate, a power generator, or something else? And we also had an incubator baby exhibit at Coney Island, one of the most famous ones. So all these different mysteries in this land of where a reset seems to have occurred, which could have been one of the significant starting points, as we have New York City as the first main population center in the United States. Join me as we explore these mysteries of Coney Island, the old world playground. Port of entry, post-reset 18-year unknown. Why would we say that Coney Island is a port of entry? And what would that really mean? Looking at Coney Island today, we can see that it's been through many of the modernizations or urban renewal efforts of the 1960s. And indeed, that rather familiar-looking real estate developer we saw in the intro, we'll look into his account of how he tried to renew and reinvigorate this particular area in the 1960s. But what's really the official historical account that we have with Coney Island, and why is it significant? Well, we understand that its positioning is right in the area between Upper New York Bay and Lower New York Bay. And of course, I jest about the various names that we have for all of our bodies of water because they always seem to be changing, much like we change other names. I'm not going to say anything about military bases in the United States. But we can see here that Coney Island is a part of Brooklyn, and that it divides Upper New York Bay and Lower New York Bay. So all of the main shipping coming from the Atlantic had to go by or pass by Coney Island, positioned right here. Now really think on this. Was this actually an original port of entry? We understand that Ellis Island and the area leading into New York City was really the port of entry into the United States. Or was there some other story that we have? A different account of Coney Island? Now, there are different maps that show us that it was originally a series of islands, as it runs all the way out to Long Island. There's also different stories or historical records that indicate that the very first cities, indeed Gravesend just north of Coney Island, or the next neighborhood over in Brooklyn, which is what Coney Island and Gravesend are part of, were the original settlements of the Dutch in what is today New York Harbor. But that's the official historical account. Ah yes, Gravesend. Very intriguing, isn't it, that we have a little steeple church that marked an entire town. Of course, those are the kinds of anomalies that you have when you look at the original maps. And is there something significant about Gravesend? Is there something significant about this overall existence of the way that these settlements come together? And indeed, the way that Coney Island and Long Island was stated to be different islands. Now, development, changes in the environment, did it actually cause all of these different pieces of land to become amalgamated, or was there something else that occurred? Looking at the bird's eye view of Coney Island, which we have, and for those of you who aren't familiar, Coney Island became an amusement park. And the stated reason for this was because it was accessible to many people looking to get away from the vast tenements in New York City or Manhattan Island in the 1880s and onward. And it led to the development of these amusement parks. Although the three great amusement parks that made up Coney Island were all constructed from 1890 to 1910. Ah yes, a very puzzling 20-year time period. And looking at the bird's eye view, we can see here, zooming in on Steeplechase Park, which was one of the main parks, we see the very puzzling architecture and also some of the fun rides. Now, were these really roller coasters, or could they have represented something else? Perhaps a larger apparatus, thinking outside the box a little bit. Looking at Luna Park, we see that it has a large tower in the middle of it, the second of the great parks. And interestingly enough, as we look at these parks, we see that they seem to become even greater in grandeur. As we go to Dreamland, what a very fitting name for an amusement park that has a large 300-foot tower in the middle of it. Well, I guess back during those times, you needed a large 300-foot tower to complete your amusement park experience. Now, officially, the racetrack being present, and this was horse racing, make no mistakes about it, as this was 1890 to 1910, was very critical for bringing people into the area. And then when they banned horse racing, well, that's what caused horse racing to move to Kentucky. So the official story goes. We also have another well-developed neighborhood here in Coney Island. And looking at the array of images and postcards that we have, we see the entire concept of amusement being played out. Now, let's think about this. Amusement, an active pursuit. What the defenders of the mainstream narrative oftentimes tell us, or mainstream account, or the actual history, however you want to refer to it as, is that people worked very, very hard in the 1800s and even the early 1900s. They worked long days, and the official history tells us that amusement was not an active pursuit. They really tell us that prior to the establishment of amusement parks and so on and so forth in the early 1900s, people conducted amusement as sort of a reactionary thing, or just very much they didn't have it planned in their day. Whereas now that you've built these incredible amusement parks, suddenly amusement and seeking recreation became an active pursuit. Now, is that really the way it always was, or is that just simply what we're being informed? Because when you look closely at some of this imagery, whether it's the actual photographs, and of course we always have the issue with the photographs, are they fully accurate or aren't they? They're clues, or the postcards. We do get many indications that these incredible amusement parks, the three that we went over, were very elaborate. And indeed, we asked that question, why exactly was a giant, well-lit tower, which we'll look closely at here in a second, necessary to convey the amusement in Coney Island, or these parks? And oddly enough, these parks, when you look at the official account, here we have the 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea at Luna Park, because Jules Verne was the well-known quote-unquote science fiction author of the time. And so why wouldn't you have a vast amusement park? And keep in mind, this is in the very early 1900s, before we had these numerous film adaptations, including the famous one with Kirk Douglas with 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. But of course we have a wonderful display and a ride that you could really go on. I mean, whatever you want to call it. And of course it's filled with very elaborate and impressive architecture. To include our favorite cartouche symbol. Ah yes, we had to ensure that we built our favorite cartouche symbol all over these structures. And if you pay attention, you'll see that there are numerous details that show us unique symbols that are arrayed all over these particular parks. Now look at this particular tower. This isn't exactly the kind of design that you'd see. Now, I understand that people will say or think that perhaps these structures were made out of very cheap or temporary material, as amusement parks tend to be. And there are some indications of that when we look at the images. But there are other indications that show us that these were constructed out of more permanent materials, or something that was designed to last. Now, you may be asking, what exactly happened to Coney Island? And I'm sure you'll never guess it because, it's a story or a historical record that we've never come across before. Destruction by either natural disaster or fire. I'm sure you can guess where the story is already going. But before we get to that, really look at some of these structures and appreciate the detailing that went into them. And let's be considerate here. Let's just suppose that these structures really are all made out of temporary material, whether we want to call it stucco, plaster, or staff. The variations that we have. I'm always interested in the fact that we have wonderfully designated temporary materials. It's interesting to me that even with temporary materials, we were able to construct and put this kind of effort into this sort of detailing, as though we had to make the park incredibly beautiful. And yet our amusement parks to this day certainly don't match this in any way, shape, or form. Now, is that to say that necessarily proves anything? No. We can certainly go with the understood historical comprehension of what the society was like at this time, that yes, people did work harder, and yes, they did put more artistic effort into their constructions. But keep in mind, where exactly does that inspiration come from if these people really are working all the time? And indeed, that's the understanding that we have, is that recreation, amusement, was not an active pursuit in the 1800s. It was something that developed later. But the issue is, if the mind is never allowed to be idle, then you're never allowed to inspire. And are we really looking at an apparatus of lost technology? Is that really what these amusement parks are? The location and the position of Coney Island is no coincidence. And keep in mind that New York, considered to be the greatest natural harbor in the world, you could understand why this could be a large port of entry. Were these structures built out of temporary appearing materials? Or were these structures already there? Or is there some other explanation? And you can see that there was a grand procession of many great activities and displays, spectacles that accompanied these incredible structures. And you can see why Coney Island was referred to as the amusement park of the world, or as we're referring to it in this particular exploration, the playground of the old world. And that was the actual sobriquet of it, playground of the world. Ah, yes, this incredible globe tower. Apparently an architect in the very early 1900s had this concept to build this very impressive and unique edifice, a vertical display of an amusement park, if you will. But not just a display, a practical application. A globe tower that was actually an amusement park in and of itself. Now again, the official history tells us that this impressive structure was never completed. But if this was beyond the means at the time, then why would anybody come up with this particular design? And looking more closely, you can just see how elaborate and exquisite this impressive edifice was, even in concept. This is something from a science fiction movie. And indeed, the gargantuan size of it seems to defy the implements that were available at the time. Now, did this only exist in concept? Or is it possible that this was also another remaining structure that was at Coney Island that was torn down over time? Well, of course, people say that's merely the realm of speculation and a wild imagination. Maybe so. But there are many other structures and details when you look closely at the images that we have of the three amusement parks in their heyday at Coney Island, which, by the way, was only from the late 1890s to 1911. And after that, unfortunately, we already began to lose many of these great structures in Coney Island, with a series of fires that beset the parks. Ah, yes, this definitely encourages the saying that the devil's in the details. And again, looking closely at some of the architecture, we have hints that there are more prevailing, more enduring construction materials that were utilized in the construction of these impressive edifices. Now, this particular impressive tower in Dreamland, which is over 300 feet. Now, this tower no longer stands, so we don't have a way to verify it. We can't assess and analyze the construction materials, unfortunately. But I'm reminded of the great, wonderful areas that we've seen across the United States that still endure to this day that are somewhat mystifying, such as the plaza in Kansas City. And look at all the effort that went into the construction of this creation display, or this creation attraction, whatever you want to call it. I have to say, there are certain details in this that seem to go way beyond what we see in modern-day Disneyland or Disney World. Perhaps we'll have to do an exploration of Lucius Aurelian's adventure to Disneyland. It's a great story. But looking closely here, we see the architectural detail of columns amalgamated into the walls again. And even looking at the older imagery of the amusement parks on Coney Island, we see some rather bizarre curiosities. Apparently this large elephant was a hotel. Now again, I don't know. I wasn't there. I'm just looking at an image and reading accounts, as are the rest of you. Now, we can accept these official historical accounts or these records, or we can question them. Because remember, historians are not the ones who are charged with actually keeping records in the moment. Who actually does that? Well, oftentimes we rely on the media. The issue with that, though, is that from official sources, the media or journalists are not qualified to ascertain the difference between a conspiracy and a conspiracy theory. Only certified historians and scientists can do that. So the people who actually keep the records are not the people who are certified to determine the difference between a conspiracy and a conspiracy theory. Does anybody ever really question that? No, probably not. But looking at some of these other images here of Luna Park and looking in the background, we do see some very interesting architecture. And the detailing that went into this, the effort that went into really creating this fairy tale land. Perhaps we can accept the fact that there was a time when people who had never actively pursued amusement just decided on a whim to invest all this time, all this effort, and all these resources into doing something that had never been done before, for a people whose lifestyle had never been suited to actively seeking amusement. I mean, really think about this. What actually compelled people to go to Coney Island, Long Island? Well, we'll be informed that because New York City was getting oppressed with all the close construction and the various tenements in the 1800s, people were seeking escape from the hot summer. So they decided to go down here to the beach, watch the elephants go on by, and appreciate this very incredible, elaborate architecture. Remember, these were people who were informed worked all the time, and their sole purpose in life was to work, and that recreation or amusement was merely a byproduct of the day. And if you remember watching some of those old historical films about the 1800s, about the couple on the farm, you might recall that the highlight of their amusement was the husband falling off the ladder and landing on his butt, and his wife laughing at him. And that was the highlight of their amusement. So we're supposed to reconcile that. Now, yes, I understand that is a historical record or a perception that people were inflicting on us from people from the 1800s, who of course we don't know and we've never talked to. Why would you go to all this effort to build and put all these resources into establishing these incredible amusement parks? Now, we understand that it was just a simple series of rides, one of the original gravity roller coasters in the 1880s, and then as time went on, they just decided to build these very impressive and incredible amusement parks, earning the sobriquet of Coney Island being the playground of the world. But is that really what it was? Or had it been the fact that there really was the remnants of all this incredible architecture, either from another civilization, an overlapping timeline, or some other explanation? I'm always willing to accept the fact that the historical account could be correct, but when you try to reconcile it and make it work, there always tends to be so many issues. Every answer creates 3 or 4 more questions, and you're always trying to understand that during this time, the late 1800s, was when the United States was still expanding westward. The resources that were still going into expanding westward. You also have to take into account the fact that there were numerous economic issues, the Great Depression before the Great Depression in the 1870s, and all the panics that ultimately warranted a complete overhaul of the U.S. economic system, the establishment of a central bank, and the imposition of federal income tax. Here is a sketch of that original gravity coaster, and that's all we have of it. You also have this interesting display or series of attractions that promote disasters, such as this Johnstown flood. Now, I don't know if that's really what this is about, and this is a very interesting structure in and of itself as well. It's a pity it's not still standing, and it could well just be some sort of temporary material. But I have to ask the question that with these turrets and these large towers of this castle appearance, is it possible that there may have been a very different explanation? There's also the interesting concept of exhibition that's displayed here in Coney Island. And indeed, the one of the 3 amusement parks that lasted the longest to the 1960s, Steeplechase, and that was because of revival efforts, they actually had large forums like this that seemed to do displays much as we've seen in the World's Fairs. So again, we have to ask those hard questions. Is Coney Island originally just a series of amusement parks? Or did it have a series of different functions, much in the same way that the World's Fairs or exhibitions did? Not only was this a port of entry, if you will, for the people coming in to settle these lands that have just recently been surveyed after the last reset, it's also a place where the new society is going to be learned and understood by these people. Because remember, the hot dog that was developed in Coney Island and sold at Coney Island. And what exactly is going on in all these displays? What are they really representing? Because oftentimes we see different symbols and we see different displays that we don't have a common understanding was in the minds of the average American or whoever, because we also understand that there were many immigrants that were coming into the United States during this time frame, that these symbols would mean anything to them. Now, once again, defenders of the mainstream account will say that it's simply because everybody had this imagination and they brought in their myths and their legends from their homelands. Fair enough. But if that's really what happened, why is it we have all this reference to a time frame from the distant past? These pantheon of deities that we see were certainly not, as we understand it, in the mainstream religious collective in the 1800s. I mean, we didn't have some sort of movement to go back to the pagan deities of the Roman or Greek times, did we? And yet, for whatever reason, we see a lot of veneration and a lot of effort designed to construct the symbols. And why would anybody want to construct a tower like this in the middle of an amusement park? You would think that the resources, if you really were devoted to an amusement park, which, remember again, we're constructing for people who we understood did not pursue amusement actively. They only did it reactively. You're going to build a giant tower instead of roller coasters or other rides or other more cost-effective means to entertain people. I mean, I thought this was the United States, and we've always been about the pursuit of capitalism, building businesses, and making money. Now, whether we acquire that through people visiting our attractions or deriving the money from the land, the pursuit has always been to make money. But much like the World's Fairs, we understand that there seemed to be a lot of money that was invested in a concept that had not been proven. And so it seems to be the contradiction there if we take money and finances at face value. Because people who typically have a lot of money are good at generating money, are good at saving it, and are good at creating more money. At least that's what we understand it. But we're supposed to accept that these people who were good at those things just suddenly decided in a bout of altruism, or all the other terms that we have for it, philanthropy, one of my favorites, that they were just going to share this with the people at the time. And indeed, that's what the official account says. Because these robber barons, these people who had made their fortunes, they wanted to be remembered fondly. And what better way to be remembered fondly than just by giving your money away? Investing your money, or really not investing it, let's be honest, you're not going to get a return on this because there was no return of positive net benefit from investing in the World's Fairs or Coney Island. Even though there were a lot of efforts to revive Coney Island. And no, those efforts didn't end after the series of fires that befell several of the parks. And there's even an account that these fires did strike. And we'll look at that very closely. But why would anybody put all of this effort and all of their resources, whether they were rich or not, because we also have to look at the fact that there were people who were hired to work here. There were people who lived in the area to make these amusement parks and to draw all these people there. And then it also comes to that old question, what came first? Did the people come first because they were seeking the beaches, or were the attractions already there and that drew the people out there? All interesting questions. Now, oddly enough, with the reactivation, or perhaps we should say with the development of transportation technology, that's the explanation that we have for people being able to commute from Manhattan Island down here to Brooklyn. And indeed, the area is connected, so perhaps that is an explanation. But looking at some of these awe-inspiring sites with the employment of electricity, and keep in mind, once again, this is in the very early 1900s. Once again, I'm amazed that we have another example of how we just seem to be able to adopt and adapt this brand new technology very efficiently and very quickly. Now, oddly enough, we look at all the long issues that we have with establishing technology now. You would think that we would be more proficient at it, but it seems as though we were more proficient at true revolutionary technology in the early 1900s than we are now. Well, perhaps the advent of more artificial intelligence will help with that. Looking at some of these postcards, though, you can see images that truly seem to convey some sort of fairy tale world, or dare I say, some sort of science fiction world. And perhaps that's the most striking drama that you have when you look at the images of Coney Island, and yet you pay attention to some of the details in the background. And so here's what we have. We have this location that leads into the entryway into New York City, in between the two major bays, which is considered one of the finest natural harbors in the world. We have numerous accounts of all these people coming through this area. Now, these aren't immigrants, these aren't people coming into New York City according to the official account, but these are people that are living in New York City that are looking for a good time and looking to get away from the island. The island being Manhattan. And of course we have all the rides that are associated with Coney Island. And that's the other question that we have to ask. Were these rides really just that, simple rides of amusement? Or is it possible that these rides themselves were also a remnant of this previous technology, or this large apparatus that for some reason had survived the last reset, if we're going with that theory, on explaining these incredible structures that are at Coney Island? Because what we really have here is an amalgamation of impressive structures and impressive machines, all in a very confined geographical area. And oddly enough, we went to a lot of effort to very well document this to this day. Now think about your own experiences going to amusement parks and what you really go there to do and what it's really about. It's about having fun, trying not to wait in line, and maybe getting some food that's not too much overpriced. But you look at some of these other images that we have of the amusement parks at Coney Island, and you also reconcile that with the postcards that we have, and it gives you the clue that there really was something very elaborate and incredible. And I have to pose that hard question, did the Globe Tower really exist? And is it possible that there were even more amazing structures that remain? This particular image right here shows us the initial train station to enter this area, and yet looking at the walkway, it gives us the impression here that it's been there for a much longer period of time and that it wasn't just recently established just 10, 15, 20 years before this image was taken. Of course, this is another one of those images that, according to the archive, has about a 15-year circa range to it. So who really knows? That's always the issue when you're trying to do any sort of image analysis. But there are no shortage of images, and really consider the society of the people that are going to this amusement park. We always have these individuals that are very well dressed. Now we could just say that was the societal mores of the time. In the 1900s in the United States, especially around New York City, everybody dressed their very finest to go out and have a good time. Because remember, according to the official historical account, seeking amusement in an active pursuit was a new concept. And so I guess this gamble paid off. This gamble to build these structures and these amusements for these people that were all coming from Manhattan Island to get away from the heat in the summer. And that's why Coney Island was established as it was. And let's not forget that years later, when a young Tom Hanks would go diving off a boat and he would encounter a mermaid. And if you know what film I'm referring to there, please let me know. And no, I'm not going to show an image from it. Steeplechase is intriguing as well because it seems to have more of the exhibitionary concept behind it. And when you look in the details, perhaps you could understand or look for an explanation for why you have some of these very intriguing architectural anomalies that are here as part of this park. And of course, many electrical lines from what particular time frame? Was this early 1900s? Was this 1920s? Did this come later? Was the park powered? And indeed, are there other accounts of very unique architecture within this park? And even looking at the beach photo, and you may recall there's been numerous explorations in the past, and most prominently I can think of John Levi referring to looking at how people on the beach seem to be rather lost. No towels, no beachwear. In this particular image, purported to be from the 19-teens or the early 1920s, again another circa image, and yes, anybody can write any date on an image, we seem to see a little bit of an amalgamation here. We have some people that are well dressed and seem out of place, and others who seem to be starting to adapt to life at the beach. And so again, more clues within the photos. Is this just simply a carousel ride, or is this ride and the power that provides it part of some other apparatus that was in existence at the time? And perhaps the story is most compelling with Coney Island because of the fact that there were so many people that were drawn to this particular area. And is it also possible that there really were more remnants here that had to be attended to over time? Because why exactly do you need very well decorated steeples and subsidiary towers on what's just supposed to be an amusement park or a display? Well, you need the stairs and the slide because it needs to look very decorative. Of course, nowadays we just do the very cheap plastic slide and we don't bother with the decorations. And the explanation for it is you don't have a helter-skelter like you did at Luna Park in the early 1900s because we're more efficient towards making money. Now, what happened to these incredible amusement parks in Coney Island? You'll never guess it. It's another story of legacy of fire. And in this case, we have magical dragon fire. This particular display that you're looking at, or this attraction, whatever you want to call it, is Dragon's Gorge. Another part of the Luna Park amusement attractions, and you can see that it's got the very impressive architecture with it, where you would actually go on a ride and you would go and see many different sights. And it featured a ride through a medieval fantasy land where you actually had dragons breathing fire. Kind of reminds me of the Dungeons & Dragons animated intro from the early 1980s. Apparently, though, these dragons really breathing fire, and there are accounts that they really did breathe fire, was not such a good idea. Because this is what caused numerous fires that ultimately burned down all of Luna Park. And there's numerous accounts of these dragons breathing fire. Ah, yes, another example of our favorite cartouche. Why do we need to build the cartouche on an amusement park ride or an attraction? Now, there is a patent for this Dragon's Gorge, interestingly enough, if you want to consider this very rudimentary sketch with some notes and figure number and then a number at the top of it, a patent. I don't know, maybe I'm going to design a patent for Doc Brown's mind reading device from the original Back to the Future movie. You know, I'll only need a single perspective, write some numbers on it, submit it to the patent office, and then I could actually have the patent for that. I'll be sure to call Robert Zemeckis to make sure he's okay with it. But all kidding aside, you think about the establishment of this ride, and then this led to a series of fires. And indeed, in the early 1900s, that's what Coney Island was known for, breaking out in fires all the time. Dreamland, the most impressive of the parks, went up in smoke in 1911. And Luna Park burned down several times, and then finally in the 1940s. Again attributed to that Dragon's Gorge attraction, where the dragons were actually breathing fire. So was this fire or was this magical fire? Where was Johnstown Flood? Yes, I'm mispronouncing that quite intentionally for fun. Why didn't they provide water or a flood that could have put out these flames? And it's intriguing to think that once again it's this account of having things that go up in fire. These impressive edifices, this very unique architecture, and indeed this amalgamation of many different mysteries that just quickly went up in smoke. And people say, well, of course it's no mystery. We never figured out how to handle fires. And you look at some of the images of utter destruction and devastation of these amusement parks, and you'll see the same things that we've seen in many of the other images that we've looked at of city destruction across the land. Granted, the Great City Fires are attributed to a timeline that encompasses in some cases over 200 to 300 years, whether we're talking about the Great Fire in London in 1666, or we're talking about the Great Chicago Fire that occurred over 200 years later. Yet something about these events seem to be a little bit more contemporary and a little closer together than we might like to admit. Now again, you could say that's speculation, and you could say that the official timeline that we have is absolutely correct, and it's unimpeachable in questioning it. But when you start to notice certain consistencies, when you start to notice certain things that constantly repeat, whether it's the fires, whether it's the situation of destruction, whether it's the concept of urban renewal or tearing down to rebuild, there's certain patterns that seem to emerge that we can't ignore. And you look at some of the images here, and it really gives you an idea of just how extensive this destruction was, meaning how many structures there really were that were there. I appreciate this particular image because here in the bottom left corner it says, "The first duty of a city is to have a firehouse. Many cities, towns, and villages hesitate to make sufficient appropriation to properly supply their fire departments." And does this continue to be a situation to this day? And why does this continue to be a situation to this day where we struggle with fires? Whether it's a pinpoint fire on a single structure, or we're talking about a massive conflagration that destroys entire cities, amusement parks, or even whole sections of forests and vast landscapes that we just seem to be helpless to do anything about every single time. Very, very impressive structure in the background there, and also giving an idea of the size and immensity of these particular amusement parks prior to their destruction, of course. And why would we have all this rubbling and all this remaining debris if this was just indeed some temporary, cheap construction material? Now, it is possible, and granted, I didn't actually go there walking around the ruins myself to know for sure, but something else that's interesting to me is that we always seem to be able to very well document these fires when they happen and this destruction when it happens. You could also claim that there's more images of destruction than there are of the parks when they were at their functional heyday, and indeed that may be the case. But oddly enough, looking at this particular image, I'm overwhelmed by the fact that we would allow this destruction to continue. We seem to be aware of this, and yet, if we go off the official historical account, we've never seemed to be able to come up with an effective countermeasure to fires. Even with our awareness of it, and even with the advancements of our technology, whether it's our construction technology, our firefighting technology, or the ability to achieve proper command and control with first responders, we always seem to be at a loss whenever these fires occur. And whether it was the early 1900s or even last year, the situation always seems to be the same, and the results are very similar. Vast destruction with the inability to respond. What's really the reason for that? Is there a greater explanation, or is it just simply, it's the will of the people? The people don't want their hard-earned money to support effective countermeasures. Well, as always, I'll leave that conclusion to you. But it is quite an interesting coincidence that these impressive amusement parks with the unique architecture and their impressive legacy of being the very first amusement parks in the United States where people actively sought recreation and amusement went up in smoke, as so many other old world structures have over time, and as so many other accounts relate to over time. Now you can just simply hand wave it away and say, yes, unfortunately things happen. It's just a vast coincidence that all the most impressive structures over time went up in smoke, whether it's the Crystal Palace in the United Kingdom, or any one of the other Crystal Palaces anywhere, or any other of the numerous structures. And believe me, we don't even need to keep a list because we already have a list kept for us. They tell us what went up in smoke. The only thing that we understand is different is when things were destroyed. Quite a coincidence, wouldn't you say? And the legacy of what remained with Coney Island. Steeplechase Park was the only park that survived in the 1960s after the fires. And of course, we may recall that in the 1960s was when the United States was facing the push for urban renewal, the concept of renewing our decaying urban centers. And of course, this led to the unbridled destruction, demolishing of these old city cores that, as we understand, were deteriorating anyway. And you can look here and see the impressive exhibition area of Steeplechase Park. And it's quite an impressive exhibitionary hall, and we'll take a look at its entire size because, once again, you might be surprised to understand just how large this playground of fun or this exhibitionary hall was for Steeplechase Park. Again, it's something else that the sheer gargantuan nature of the size is shocking, and you would expect it to be beyond the capabilities at the time to build something this immense. But apparently this is exactly what we had at Steeplechase Park. And Steeplechase Park being the last amusement park on Coney Island that did survive to the urban renewal time frame of the 1960s. And this incredible exhibitionary hall, or this attraction, or whatever you want to call it, this very large edifice that we think of when we looked at the other World's Fairs and all of their incredible expeditionary halls. Enter a real estate developer named Fred Trump. He looks rather familiar. I'm not exactly sure where I've heard that name before. Fred Trump was a very prominent real estate developer in the 1960s and took it upon himself to try to revive Coney Island, namely through Steeplechase Park. Of course, the efforts to revive Coney Island involved demolishing the playground of fun or that incredible exhibitionary hall that we just looked at, as is always the case. Now, apparently there was some real estate deals that went on with Fred Trump, and over time they continued to try to revive the Coney Island amusement park, but for whatever reason it just never approached the level that it was at the early 1900s. There are still some remnants, though, of some impressive architecture if you go to Coney Island to this day. Some hints at the old world still endures in some particular ways. Unfortunately, though, the most pronounced examples, whether we're talking about either one of the great towers in Dreamland or Luna Park, are no longer with us. But there are still hints and clues that there was impressive architecture that may have been from something before. Or again, it all just may be a big coincidence. And we even have this current high school, Abraham Lincoln High School. No, I'm not making that up. Once again, we have another Abraham Lincoln High School, whether we're in Des Moines, Illinois, or anywhere in the United States, that shows impressive old world architecture. That always seems to be the situation. So perhaps some advice I can give you if you're looking for impressive old world architecture in your neighborhood, if you live in the United States, look for the high school named Abraham Lincoln High School. And if you come across one that's not old world architecture, be sure to let me know. And the incubator babies, new humans. As if we don't have enough reasons to question and explore Coney Island, the main display of incubator babies, or the infant incubators, was in Coney Island. Yes, the mainstream historical account informs us, and you can get an idea of some of this impressive architecture too, where they showcase these infants. And we've explored this before, but what was really going on here? Were these just simply a display to showcase the technology available at the time, that if you had a premature baby that it could survive in an incubator? Let's be generous here and suppose that they did want to showcase that technology. Then why did you need to have so many incubators to showcase this? Wouldn't one single incubator have done the job? And how exactly do you reconcile this with the amusement concept of what Coney Island or the amusement parks were supposed to be about? Yes, ride your roller coaster and now go see the incubator babies. And be sure to get a hot dog on your way. And look at this. Before use and after use. Baby incubator, 12 months growth in 1 hour? Now, of course, you would say that this is just simply commercialism, marketing as we'd call it today. Or is this referring to something else? We really have to ask, what's the account with these incubator babies? Were these babies that were brought in from other areas? Or was there something else going on? Is it even possible, and yes, this is going out to the far reaches of explanations, that these were actually entirely new human beings that were being designed from the ground up? An entirely new population of human beings with, dare I say, diminished physical capabilities from the previous generation of human beings? Is that what was really happening here with these incubator babies? Was this the establishment of the new generations that were going to populate this quote-unquote new world? Maybe that's just a far-fetched science fiction concept, and that's all it is. But it's very strange to see these images of these incubator babies. And I'm not showing some of the more bizarre images because they're rather disturbing, but you can certainly look up these images on your own if you're so inclined. But this very strange showcasing, this exhibition of infants and this technology, doesn't seem to reconcile with what we expect with the society at the time. And what's with this individual's headgear? This is a very unique style at the time. And I'd like to close by looking at this Stargate, this portal. What exactly is this that we're looking at? Now, this is associated with the Coney Island exhibitions, and this is stated to have been an electric building. At least that's what the caption says, but when you look at it, there seems to be something much more elaborate behind it. Now, the official caption tells us this is Dreamland, entrance to the electric building. Yes, Dreamland, the first amusement park that went up in smoke. And when we look closely, what do we see? Again, we see these symbols, these cartouches, and these symbols that appear everywhere. Now, was this just supposed to be a temporary building? Or was this a permanent building? And again, I'm trying to reconcile the mainstream account with what's really going on. Because how could you possibly justify this? These incredible obelisks on either side of this with these cartouches on them. Again, were we showcasing our reverence for ancient Egypt and the Roman deities at the time? Or did these represent something else entirely? Because here you can see the mainstay of this cartouche. And again, I get the impression that this is some very elaborate technological device. And no, there are really no other images I could find of this particular apparatus. Is this a Stargate? Is this a portal? Is this some sort of power generation device? Is it more? Or could it be something else entirely? What do you think? Let me know in the comments, and by all means, let me know if you've seen other images of this electric building, or the entrance to the electrical building, or the entrance to the Dreamland electric building, whatever it is. Well, thank you for joining me. I hope you appreciated this exploration of Coney Island. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel. Thank you for joining me today. About a year ago on the channel in the spring of 2023, we did an exploration called Designs of the Old World, where we looked into the particular designs of these rather erratic French architects, Lequeux, pictured here, and Boully. We don't really have a picture of Boully, but here's a very intriguing picture of Lequeux. Looks like he could be portrayed by Thomas Hulce in a movie, and looks quite similar to what we saw of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart in the eponymous film, Amadeus. Regardless, the works of these particular architects are quite intriguing. We're told that these French architects, draughtsmen, or all the other different names that we have for individuals who design buildings, because we need to have many different names for them, are considered very eccentric and elaborate. And indeed, this particular sphere here shows us a rather unique architectural format. Now, of course, we're told that these were merely the buildings that existed in the imaginations or the conceptualizations of these French architects. And I suggested about a year ago that, in fact, these were actually recordings of buildings that may have existed. Now, what's the evidence behind this? I figured we'd go back and we'd actually take a look that this is actually a full archive of the structures that may have remained from the previous civilization. In the drawings that are attributed to Lequeux, we see a great precision in detailing. And if you want to go back and watch the video from last year, I'll attach it in the description for this video. But in these images that we're reviewing, you can see that he left no detail spared when he was considering the layout for these buildings. For example, look at the top of this particular structure, and we see this ornamental detailing at the top. Is that just from his elaborate imagination? What exactly is with this very tall needle spire here on this part of the structure? It's really unique, and oftentimes it gives the impression that really what we have is simply a recording, that what they were doing is that they were recording what they saw, that this wasn't some elaborate imagination. Now here's where it gets more interesting, is when you look at some of his other structures, look at the interior behind this one. What exactly is this? This appears to be under rock. And we think about all the theories that we have concerning melted buildings. And indeed, we have seen these phenomena before. Whether you're looking at the coke kiln ovens in Utah that John Levi has so wonderfully explored, or many other structures. So why would someone lay out a structure like this in a conceptualized design that was displaying this? Unless what they were really looking at was the remnants of a structure that had survived a reset from the previous civilization, and they were recording it before it was going to be demolished, salvaged, certainly not repurposed for use. Look at this very intricate, this looks to be like a fountain, but who knows exactly what this is for sure. Perhaps this is some sort of advanced power generation device or some form of technology we can't understand. Now, I'm well aware we're going to be derided for even considering this, but I'm not hesitating now. And given the fact that the channel's been going for a year, I think we've shown many examples in on-site explorations where we see architecture like this and a different purpose. And it seems that our friends Lequeux and Boully were the perfect individuals who could record this. Now, you might recall this very interesting interior that we have for this particular structure. What exactly is this? Well, this came up a couple different times as some sort of crystal power generation technology. What exactly was going on with this fire? Is this some sort of generator, or is this something else entirely? Interestingly enough is that these drawings are so detailed, these works of art, that they really do come off as being actual recordings, cross-section recordings. And indeed, this is the kind of detail that we'd expect to see in many of the structures that we've explored on the ground, and yet for whatever reason, the plans, the schematics just aren't available, or if they are, they're in a single perspective. And yet when we look at these works, for example here, what's going on here? Is this actually a cave exploration? Or is this again a recording of something that remained from a previous civilization? You notice the focus on what appears to be a monument or a memorial, or at least that's what we'd think of it as. And yet underground here in this cave, we have this very elaborate statue, this fountain, that seems to be depicting something that we would not consider modest, since we're told that the mores of society, when these schematics, these concepts were drawn, were a little different than what they are now. So it's something that really defies what we're told about history and the narrative. And we do see that from both Lequeux and Boully, very elaborate designs. Incredible fountains, multi-layer structures, and very unique architectural stylings. And yet at the same time, while we're told that this is some sort of elaborate and eccentric conceptualization, we've seen examples of these in every city in the Midwest of the United States, in many cities in Europe, and in Asia and everywhere else that we've explored. We've seen examples of this fine detailed architecture. Even the size of the interior of the structure, which is featured on the thumbnail for this exploration, look at the size of these columns and their height. Now remember, we have that Grand Avenue water tower in St. Louis, and remember how tall that column was. Now imagine what kind of structure you could really achieve if you had this many columns. Again, this is something that was considered eccentric, and this is supposedly attributed to Boully, but I don't think it really matters who it's attributed to. Look at the gargantuan and colossal interior of this particular structure. What exactly is going on here? Again, is this something they're recording, or is this some sort of event that was occurring in the structure before it was brought down? It's very detailed, and indeed you can see how far the columns go. One could think that this would invigorate the imaginations, or perhaps what this was a recording of a structure that existed, and it's now found its way into other what we would consider fantasy drawings, and indeed it's now affiliated with fantasy, and there's a very defined reason for that. And yet in these other structures, we've seen similar layouts in many of the large Union stations that we've looked at, where it seems as though we're looking at a hangar of some sort. What would really be the purpose for laying out a building like this with all these columns lining the walls? And we're to believe that looking at the image, this is a library, and yet this seems to be a massive hangar. We've seen these indentations and impressions before on other structures. What's with the opening at the top? Well, it's to provide lighting so that they could read during the day because they didn't have electricity at that time. That seems rather comical now. And yet this would be a very interesting repurposing of this building if it still stood and they were attempting to salvage all the books that they had. But what was its original intention and purpose? Well, let me know what you think in the comments. And yet Boully had other designs attributed to him. For example, we see the classic pyramid design here. Very, very advanced looking with some obelisks flanking it on either side. And yet when you look at the structure, you can see that this is smaller blocks, and yet there's a fine pattern detailing within this. Now, think about the effort that went into this sketch as well. What kind of effort did someone put into sketching this? And just zoom in a little bit here so you can actually see the size of individuals, people, for scaling. Although, of course, that's not always reliable because who knows exactly how tall these people depicted in this image are. Now, once again, this will be derided, but if you look in other aspects of this image, you can see that there's more obelisks on the other side of this pyramid structure. So again, is this something that survived the reset from a previous civilization? There seems to be some definitive evidence for that. And we also have Boully's other drawings where it's not just pyramids, but we also have spheres, the same spheres that were depicted by Lequeux, supposedly, that depict a completely different kind of architectural styling. And yet, once again, for some reason, these particular sketches, these drawings, this elaborate imagination of Boully, here where we're mixing a sphere with a pyramid or cone structure, somehow this has survived to reach us. Now, is it really just so simple to say that this is the wild imagination of an architect with too much time on their hands? I'm always amazed at all the time that we seem to think that our architects have, that they can do so many projects at the same time. And then as if that's not enough, they can then devote their time to doing conceptual projects. And they just like to draw. And oddly enough, you do have art that's associated with architects. And yet at the same time, Art Deco is considered a thing of the past. And the justification will be because people wanted brutalist architecture, people wanted postmodern architecture, because it's a little bit more convenient. What are your thoughts looking at this intriguing structure with this large sphere and this cone and the size and the scale? and clearly these seem to be columns. What scale is this? Would this be achievable with today's technology? No, of course not. We'll be told that this is merely the wild imagination of some architects with too much time on their hands. That they could lay out buildings that were utterly gargantuan in size and didn't really make a lot of sense at that time, and they don't make any sense now. But the troubling aspect is we have seen many of the details of these structures. We've seen them in all of our explorations on the ground. So if the details exist, was this just someone putting it together with their imagination to make something that was just beyond the scope of reality? And why do I keep mentioning the fact that these were legitimate architects, at least that we're told that they were? Well, because they did actually design buildings. Indeed, there's a hotel in Paris that was designed by Bouley. And yet at the same time, he was also conceptualizing these very impressive structures, these large spheres. It seems to me that this is indicative of a completely different architectural style that did not exist to the official account, and yet this is an indication of something that did exist. And what do we have here? Our favorite lions, because of course we always have our lions by our buildings. And then a compilation of works supposedly attributed to Bouley. We've seen this one in the lower right. And in the upper right, we see what appears to be some very interesting power generation device. Now, of course, we'll be told that it's supposed to be some sort of observatory, some sort of planetarium, because it's a sphere, and we automatically associate sphere with round and globe, and etc., etc. And yet we're seeing more indications of architectural stylings. And indeed, imagine a world capital, or perhaps I should say a land capital of an entire civilization that would reach this size, where you have a pediment this extensive, lines of people walking up to the entryway, and numerous columns, along with a dome, flanked by many, many, many columns. What exactly is this telling us, and how large is this cupola at the top? And what are your thoughts on these images? And I'll close off by just saying the rather modest hotel that still stands to this day that's attributed to Bouley. And yet, interestingly enough, it does still show old world construction, design, and detailing around this portal window, and then a very well designed column. But what other evidence do we have that would give us the indication that these designs attributed to these erratic and yet ingenious French architects were a little bit more than simply the product of their imaginations? If you scan our libraries and our own archives, what you'll find is no shortage of books that were supposedly composed by architects. Yes, they tell us that architects did these very painstakingly rendered sketches or drawings of the exterior and interiors of what we consider to be old world buildings. This particular one was published in the 1880s or so, we're told, although oftentimes I question that. And yet what we'll see is the elaborate interior of many different structures, whether it's a cathedral, a church, a basilica, or whatever we've decided to call it now. And we'll see many of the same detailings that we've seen in our on-site explorations, whether we were in state capitals or any other sort of building where we see the massive columns, we have the impressions within the ceiling. This looks to be like a massive oculus, and we have a pediment here. And then you can see the individuals in this drawing with this stairway to give you an idea for scale. What's intriguing is that these architects, again, seem to have all kinds of time to where they could go around and compose books that are well over 500 pages with all these wondrous sketches. Now, how much time was involved in doing these sketches? And the other question that would come down to is, why didn't they just do a picture documentation? Or perhaps this was a different way of doing that. And indeed, we can see many of the fine details and questionable symbols that we've come across in our old world explorations, throughout on-site explorations and all across the land. Now, what is this really showing us? I am under the impression that, once again, this is an archive. This is a record of surviving examples of structures, and even alluding to technology, that we're told that was done under the facade of an architect to preserve all this. Now, there's no doubt that it was to be preserved, but preserved in what fashion? And could this have been simply a massive catalog or a compendium of everything which had survived, the most dramatic examples, which those in power might feel could potentially cause questions that they didn't want asked? For example, in this particular sketch, again from the 1880s, we see stylings that we would associate with the Art Deco style. although we're told that Art Deco is very much a product of the 20th century. So this seems to be another anachronism, something that doesn't match what we're told in the timeline. Or maybe you're just going to say you're using your imagination. This isn't actually Art Deco styling. But what's really going on with all this detailing? And we can see that this particular architect decided to capture other things which we wouldn't traditionally associate with architecture, but more of an art affiliation with it. So was it really an architect drawing this, or was it someone else? Because again, we see signs of the technology that's been captured, and that seems to be the intent behind it. Now, if you go to a later portion of this same book, you will find that they also decide to detail what they call trophies or compilations of what appears to be coats of arms and urns and other decorations. Yes, once again we see our favorite griffin depicted here on what appear to be urns. But are these urns? This kind of reminds me of that owl that we saw in that courthouse in Iowa. So very intriguing when we see many of the replications of the symbols all over the place that show us different aspects of the previous civilization. Obviously, this seems to be something that was done as a great catalog, but the fact that we're told that this is merely an architect who is concerned with capturing certain portions of buildings, and yet they seemed more concerned with artwork. And indeed, you'll find that there is a catalog of statues in this compendium. What exactly does that have to do with architecture? Well, everything, because we need to put statues to make it into complete architecture, right? We've seen this particular object before, and we've speculated that maybe it has something to do with power generation, or it reflects something of the previous civilization, and here it's just put in this nice little urn. And then we see other devices that have been very painstakingly cataloged, again in sketches, not with photographs. Now, why would someone go to all this trouble to make all these sketches? Obviously, all these things that we're looking at existed, or maybe it's not so obvious. But if it's not so obvious, then who had the time and inclination, especially in the 1800s, to compose something from their imagination? And now you see how it relates back to the works of Lequeux and Boully that we looked at earlier in this exploration. Why would somebody be devoting time, especially in that time frame that we're told, where people had no time? In fact, we're told that people worked long days, 7 days a week, and they walked uphill to school both ways. And yet we see other interesting symbols and aspects. For example, we've seen this particular symbol before. Now, I'm not going to tell you what the name of it is. I don't think I should have to. But let's just say we've seen this sort of geometry in many different explorations, whether it's a state capitol or just some random commercial building, or even that lovely plumber building in Rochester, Minnesota. It all comes up and it's all repeated in many different examples. And yet, once again, we see that they decide to capture some of the tombs. Now, why would they be so concerned about the tombs? And remember that in the earlier works, we saw this focus on tombs. Or are these tombs? Are these vaults that are, once again, remnants of a previous civilization, with their detailing captured on them? So many different details in so many different places, and let's consider the fact that somebody had to go through the trouble of building this. Somebody should have original sketches or schematics, and then we're to believe that an architect came around later and decided they were going to do sketches in a 500-page book. And so many books that you can't even count that were 500 pages or more that show all these fine-tuned examples. I'd almost think that there was some sort of old world explorer going around in the 1800s that was going around doing these kind of sketches to record this. Although I'm not under the impression that they had the same intention of exploration that we do. What this feels like is that these objects, these devices, these pieces of technology, or this architecture as we consider it, was simply being recorded and cataloged. Now, was that for redesignation? Was that for some sort of method of deciding what was going to remain and what was going to be removed, if they indeed had the means? Well, that's up for you to decide. Let me know what you think in the comments. But still, it's a lot of work and a lot of effort just to record all this, just to get the details that we see. And yet we see so many of the signs, so many of the symbols that we've actually seen in many of our on-site explorations over the past year. There's also a focus on statues. Now, I'm not going to repeat the point that what's an architect doing sketching statues and what's supposed to be a work that's documenting architecture. And we have all these questionable aspects with the statues. Is this really the Virgin holding the Savior, or is this depicting something else? Well, I'll leave that for you to decide. We also have these urns or these fountains that are depicted, whatever purpose that we're given with them. And again, we see aspects of the same symbolism that we've come across in our other explorations. So, very well documented. And yes, I am going to use that terminology because somebody did go through a lot of effort to sketch all of this and to catalog all this for inclusion within this book. And we're lucky that we're able to gaze on all these different aspects because we see not only detailed architecture, not only advanced construction, but also signs and hints of much more advanced technology that comes down in all these different, what do we want to call these? Altars, these trophies, these fountains, these wells. Yes, you need to have a very well-designed well. Get it? But then last but not least, the book concludes with some of the most advanced decorations that you'll see, and that's what we'll be told. These are just decorations on a window. It gives a whole new meaning to window dressing, doesn't it? Look at how this was achieved. Think about this. Was this really carved out? And yet this drawing even includes the actual individual bricks and every single detail in terms of what was actually rendered here. And when you really look at this, you can actually see it. You just have to think of all the time that, again, went into the effort to originally construct this, whether this was sculpted, carved, even bigger laugh, or if this is some sort of advanced geopolymer that was formed through some technique that we don't fully understand, and then poured in place. Or was it some sort of advanced 3D printing? Or was it some sort of combination of techniques that we can't even begin to imagine? These are the kind of ideas that we get when we look at these very impressive images. And we think about the different aspects of either modular construction, whether these were constructed in different pieces and then assembled. But then I also ask you to think about the individual who went through the trouble of cataloging and documenting all this with all these painstaking drawings and every single detail that they captured. Also pay attention to the symbols. You'll see everything that we've seen. Lions, griffins, fasces, numerous columns, different other sorts of figures that indicate other things. This cartouche, this display device, whatever you want to call it. We have so many different names for it, but we've seen the same thing. And we've seen it all over the land. It doesn't matter where we are or what we're doing, we see the same symbols. And once again, this gives us that impression and that evidence that we did have a civilization that spanned the lands. The same civilization that reflected all of its grandeur and its architecture and its surviving technology. And when you look at all these books and all these renderings, and there's thousands upon thousands of drawings just like this that show this kind of detailing. This is just window dressing. And yet somebody had the time, the effort, and the inclination to do this, to decorate a window in this manner. And we've seen this all over the realm. We've seen this all over the land. All these figures and all the effort that went into imposing this just on a window. And somebody decided to take the effort to draw it after this was done. So what are your thoughts? Let me know in the comments. Are we really to believe that the people of the medieval time frame and then the Renaissance and then the 16 to the 1800s had all that time, all that effort, all those resources that they decided to build all these buildings and then put this kind of detailing into it? That they even continued this up until the early 1900s, according to our official account, and then they just decided to stop it because then World War II happened. And after World War II, no one seemed interested in projecting artwork in their structures anymore. We went to brutalist and then postmodern, where everything was supposedly functional, cost-effective, and economically viable. And yet the same thing supposedly applied in the past, and yet for whatever reason, we're to believe that the previous civilizations that were told in our official history that preceded us, and some of them that still exist to this day, had the time, the inclination, and the logistical capacity to achieve these wondrous works of art in their simple window dressings. So yes, I don't think I'll ever hear window dressing with the same term again. But in conclusion, what we're really seeing is that this work of art is something that we just don't really do anymore. And we're supposed to believe it's because we lack the inclination. It's not because we lack the capability. Or some will argue that we lack the capability because people have changed and everyone's just gotten lazy and people don't work as hard as they used to. And if you just work hard, then you can achieve logistical impossibilities because you didn't need heavy machinery. You didn't need the ability to haul construction materials over many miles or hundreds of miles with a limited logistical capacity to even establish the building blocks for many of these structures that still stand to this day. And my final closing point is that this seems to show us true evidence that there was an effort made to record all the remnants of the old world. And you can find it with the detailings of these structures, many of which still stand to this day, showing their exterior and the interiors. And then when you consider the works of what we're told are attributed to extravagant and exotic French architects who just had too much time on their hands, it suddenly brings an entirely different perception towards their works. Perhaps what they were really doing is they were really recording the structures that did remain, or had somehow survived the reset before they were brought down and repurposed, or the building materials salvaged for use in other buildings. But what are your thoughts? I'll include the link to this particular book in the description of the video. Well, thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel, and thank you for joining me today. We're going to be exploring designs of the old world, visionaries, prophets, or recorders. France, circa 1760 to 1815, although who knows what years this actually occurred, or if this did ever in fact occur, or if this is some other sort of account that we're going to be looking at. But we're going to be looking at a variety of renderings and drawings of different building designs that were supposedly by two different visionary architects. Or were they prophets, or were they simply recorders? We're going to be exploring that in detail and trying to come up with some explanations for what we're about to look at and what it was really representing. So let's take a look at our first architect from France, Jean-Jacques Lequeux, and I'll do the best I can with the pronunciations, but French was not a language I ever had to speak extensively in my travels. Certainly a lot of Spanish, Espanol, and even Arabic, but that's just my particular background. Jean-Jacques Lequeux was a French draughtsman, and what's a French draughtsman? Well, a draughtsman is someone who's into technical drawing, drafting, or drawing. It is the act and discipline of composing drawings that visually communicate how something functions or is constructed. So it seems like right off the bat that Mr. Lequeux is somebody who is extremely talented when it came to producing drawings, technical drawings, and understanding buildings, and he was also an architect. Well, let's learn more about him. Lequeux was born in Rouen and won a scholarship to go to Paris. Following the French Revolution, his architectural career never took off. He spent time preparing the Architecture Civile, a book intended for publication, but which was never published. He became a civil servant, working as a surveyor and a cartographer until his retirement in 1815. Interesting self-portrait there. Lequeux is now considered part of the period of visionary architecture, which developed in the period leading up to the French Revolution. This was directly influenced by the great competitions organized by the École des Beaux-Arts. Why is it always great competitions? All these great competitions that we had, they loved to compete back then. Nothing wrong with that. We love to compete now, but it's just something interesting to note. These competitions encouraged entries comprising massive buildings unfettered by budgetary constraints. Oh, of course they did. Why? This resulted in scores of designs for vast and impressive buildings which had little connection with the real world and remained paper architecture. Well, architects of this genre include Claude Nicolas Ledoux, Etienne Louis Boully, who we'll be looking at momentarily, and Antoine Laurent Thomas Vador. Most of these, like Lequeux, are more famous for their unbuilt works than for buildings actually constructed. Ah, yes, they have this one well covered. So you see, we're going to be looking at some buildings that are just very extreme and don't really have any basis in reality. Most of his drawings can be found at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. Some of them are pornographic and are kept in the Enfer of the library. That's always an interesting concept when you think about that. Although, who defines what's pornographic? Some people could say that the statue of Iowa on the Iowa Soldiers and Sailors Monument could be considered pornographic. But I digress. They include a cow barn in the shape of an Assyrian bovine, an erotic garden folly called the Hammock of Love, replete with a copulating couple. What else? Okay, just going to keep moving on here because we can see what direction that's going. Lequeux's historiography has led to a deep reflection. It was only at the middle of the 20th century that he was rediscovered by the Viennese historian Emil Kaufmann. What is it with all these things that always get rediscovered, and why is it always in the 20th century sometime? It's a fascinating aspect. Kaufmann saw in Lequeux a revolutionary architect, as well as Boully and Ledoux, but this epithet must be used with caution. Although some of his drawings express sympathy for revolutionary ideas, his views seem to have evolved in line with social and political changes. Wait a minute, what? So he's a revolutionary architect? Was it because he embraced social and political changes, or was it because his work was actually creative? Well, never mind. It was not until 1986, however, that the first monograph devoted to Lequeux was published, written by architect and architectural historian Philippe Dubois. This pioneering work takes the controversial view that Lequeux's work is partially the result of a deliberate manipulation involving Marcel Duchamp. As early as 1987, the theorist and historian of architecture Joseph Reichwart, in a review of Du Bois' book, underlined the weakness of his scientific justification, which mixed fact, fiction, fancy, incongruous comparisons, and the most unverifiable conjectures. According to Elisa Boré, boy, we've got so many people in this account, assumptions that Duchamp contributed to the possible manipulation of Lequeux's legacy at the National Library now appear to be chimerical. American art historian and art critic James Elkins considers this is a deliberate hoax. So it's all just a hoax. Okay. There is ambiguity surrounding the relations of Lequeux to surrealism. A kind of retrospective illusion could lead us to see several of Lequeux's drawings through the prism of the paintings by de Chirico, Magritte, or Davot. But if we refer to the writings of André Breton and his friends, and even those of Marcel Duchamp, it is very difficult to find any trace of admiration for Lequeux, who is not mentioned either by the first historians of this artistic movement. Lequeux died in Paris in 1826. So a lot of controversy, a lot of contradiction, and how do we know if this individual even ever lived? Well, that seems to be the point. Have many, many questions, but we've got some great artwork. And by the way, there's some pornography in it, so you can't really take it seriously. Sheer brilliance. Love the mainstream account. So after reading that contradictory and conflicting mainstream account about the biography and questionable existence of Jean-Jacques Lequeux, let's talk about preconceived notions. If we had read that article before looking at Lequeux's alleged work, we're coming into this thinking, okay, these are just works of fantasy, this is architecture that's not real. And yet, when you look at the conflicting account within the biography, you see that this was an individual who was an architect and someone who was a specialist in technical drawings. So the question I have is, why would someone who is allegedly a specialist in technical drawings do fantasy work of architecture? Why would that be popular around the so-called Napoleonic era in the middle of Europe, in the 1760s all the way to the 1820s? It just doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, the only contemporary I can think of to compare this to is if you're familiar with Sid Mead, who is a visual futurist, and he's most famous for the works he did on the original Blade Runner movie, something that was considered very ahead of its time and very futuristic. And how are you going to get a living doing that? Well, now you can design images for science fiction movies, you can have book compilations. But was Jean-Jacques Lequeux making book compilations back then? It said he was, but it was never sold. But then he had a more legitimate job. So which is it? Was he a surveyor? Was he an architect? Who knows? The reason I bring that up is as we look at these drawings, these renderings, these pictures of these remarkable buildings, let's try to keep more of an open mind and not have our judgment skewed by what we just read, because it's clear somebody wants us to think that these are just absurd buildings that aren't even possible. And when you look at this first building, I mean, just remarkable, spherical globe almost, and it looks like a depiction of a globe, surrounded by the old pillars and columns with faces on it, and just an enormous building. What I find interesting, though, is the depiction of the interior, what looks to be some sort of planetarium aspect and a very large globe in the middle. Consider, could this be a real building that was once in existence? And did Lequeux design and draw this or imagine this? Or was he simply recording what he saw? Think about it. If these were people who had come back after a reset and they had come across some spectacular buildings, in addition to locating and identifying where these buildings were, another focus they would have would be understanding these buildings and perhaps even recording them. Now, of course, we could ask, well, why would they allow these recordings to survive? Perhaps this was their method of ensuring that some aspects of the architecture and some aspects of the techniques, whether it was drawing or drafting or something, was preserved. In any event, if it is just from Mr. Lequeux or somebody else's imagination that we're not aware of, it is truly beautiful and remarkable. And this is where things get very interesting, because here you see a building on fire. And again, it's another very large and impressive building. And the detail in it's just incredible. And again, we don't know if this is just something from his imagination or if he's recording something he saw. Well, this is a building that can't survive because there's no way to explain it, so we're destroying it. That's one possible explanation. Or why would, in his imaginations of amazing architecture, he would draw something like this? Of course, then we throw in the fact that he drew many pornographic images, so that discredits anything that was done as well. It's just an amazing amalgamation of a story that's remarkable. So that's why I think we just need to look at the images without taking that into consideration, because looking at them on their own and trying to determine the story they tell us is much more interesting. And I think, honestly, we'll get a more accurate indication of what really happened. I mean, look at this over here. It looks like you have some sort of army and security forces around this, and who knows what's really going on, but it looks like this building is being destroyed, and it's out on its own in the middle of the forest. Oh, can't explain it, so we can't say this is a monument. We can't repurpose this, so it's got to be burned down. Use any means necessary and make it happen. Beautiful drawing, beautiful building. And yet here's another one, and this is even interesting because you see what appears to be a fire, a kiln, and then smoke coming out of it. But I mean, on the other hand, what's so fantastical about this? I mean, here you have this amazing statue, and again, this is just a building that it looks as though someone found in the middle of the forest. And why was he depicting these buildings in the middle of a forest or in the middle of the wild? It's quite remarkable. Was it isolated from a city? Or, if we consider our recent explorations of more rural areas, is it possible that there were some amazing buildings that were just isolated and they really couldn't be explained? And that would certainly come down to the explanation that they had to destroy them using any means necessary. I mean, if you're in an existing large city and you have more massive architecture there, well, that's at least easy to explain, especially if you're trying to plan ahead. But this is just remarkable, the detail that goes into this. And again, you're saying this is fantasy architecture, and so that's why it's depicted here. Okay, I guess you can go with that explanation. And it could be true. The historical narrative could be entirely true in this fact. But it's remarkable to think that there is some elements of realism, especially with some of these drawings, and the scale is not too absurd. I mean, just slightly larger than trees. We know, even according to our mainstream account, that we could build buildings before this time that were much larger than this. Just take the Pantheon, for example. This is a very interesting one because here you do see what looks to be an interior cross-section of what is some very large building. I mean, whether it's a cathedral, a church, or something else. I mean, yes, we can look at the French words and translate and interpret, but not on that today. I just want to look at what's visually depicted. And again, just looking at the little details that went into this cross-section. I mean, here you have this amazing statue, the arches that we tend to see. Not sure what is going on here. I mean, a cross-section of the statue. You think if you ever go to the interesting replicas that we call many of the buildings that we have across the world, yet I wouldn't say they're replicas. I would just say they're actual buildings that were built in different locations. You see this phenomenon where there's aspects that are repeated, especially with the huge columns that are all over the place. And again, you just see it in the matching detail, the doorways, and then look at this. I mean, is this a shaft? Is this a tower shaft? And what is this? I mean, we can't really take anything off the table. Is this some other method of a power source, or does this have some sort of symbolic function? What was really the purpose of this building? I'm sure they'll tell us. And it's interesting because, okay, if this is all a fantasy building, then obviously nothing that's depicted here then is supposed to be any sort of realistic aspect of function. It's simply artistic design. But yet when you look at the cross-section of this entire amazing building, everything seems to imply function. It does not imply design. It's quite fascinating. Even the statue seems like there's some sort of purpose to it beyond just being an artistic piece. And yet, artistically, it looks unbelievably inspiring. And then here's a couple other buildings that Lequeux drew. And saw that this was titled a pagoda, and I remember the pagoda I saw that was in Germany post World War II back in the German book Exploration. And I mean, this is just a beautiful, amazing building. This doesn't look like something you would see in France and Germany. Of course, when you actually go exploring around there, you see there's a wide variety of different buildings that look like they're from different eras. Just like if you look at that photo of San Francisco from the 19th century, that entire panoramic photo that I believe was taken in the mid 1870s, you see a lot of buildings that look like this. And it's another one of those aspects that defies explanation. And again, this doesn't seem like a building that seems too fantastic aside from some of the towers or even the main tower itself. I mean, apparently what we were told is that this would be a building that would be possible to construct at that time. But who's to know or who's to say? And it's the same thing with these buildings over here. This one down here in the lower right is quite fascinating because here you see a lot more detail with some of the edging on the pillars or the columns. So you have to wonder, let's just suppose that Lequeux or whoever was around then and they were doing technical drawings of the buildings that were available. What was the focus? What buildings were they trying to capture first? And I think what they would have been tasked to capture first would have been the buildings that were selected for immediate destruction, because those are the buildings you'd have to capture on drawing, and those are also the same buildings that once you have drawings of, you could say, well, these buildings don't exist anymore. This is just the fantasy of these artists at the time. Although we're going to say they're architects, and we're also going to say they were experts in technical drawing. So again, many conflicts, but quite beautiful imagery nonetheless. And here is supposedly a hotel, an entryway to the room, but I mean, look at all this ornate design that goes into this and just a doorway. Now, we could say that this is more of an artistic drawing, of course, but you know, being in the inside of some government buildings that some people say, oh yes, they're just boring old government buildings, but then you see this kind of ornate and elaborate detail. You know, I think of some of the state capitals I've been in, but also many of the county courthouses where you see this across the United States, where things like this just aren't supposed to exist. Or if they do, maybe someone should have been a little bit more discretionary on the expenditure of tax dollars. But let's be honest, that's not for the people to ever decide. You're just supposed to pay and roll with it. In any event, it's a very beautiful depiction. And then here's another one. I'm not sure if this is more of a residence or what, but and it looks like they threw in this drawing, and of course showing the whole pornographic aspect to almost discredit the work or to kind of put something that people wouldn't consider so serious on it. So I don't know, different societal norms at that time, and yet we're told conflicting accounts of what was acceptable from the 18th and 19th centuries, and that's a discussion for another time. But just amazing detail focusing on this structure, whether it's a residence or whatever. I mean, imagine having a house like this that was this well constructed, that you could afford, that you could have for the rest of your life and would stay in your family for generations indefinitely. You knew it was made of the finest material, and it's as though they try to keep that impression going by the buildings that did survive, saying they constantly have to do renovation work, otherwise they're going to fall down tomorrow. And we can't think of all the times I saw scaffolding on the Iowa State Capitol, but when you try to get an answer and you ask what questions they're doing in the renovations, they can never really tell you. Well, we're replacing brick. But then, of course, you don't see any brick at any point in time, or any brick removed or being replaced. Well, we're replacing the sandstone. And again, you don't see any sandstone. It's interesting. And nobody ever questions it because, why would they? But just imagine a beautiful residence like this, remarkable building. This was a very interesting rendering because this almost looks like an airship or a balloon. And we know that the first balloon in history was innovated supposedly in the 18th century, according to the mainstream timeline and that we have. But I found this in the collection of drawings of Lequeux. Now, I don't know if this is one of his drawings. Frankly, anybody could have done these drawings and these renderings, or many different people could have. But they're attributed to Lequeux, so that's why we're looking at them under his authorship. But in any event, you look at this and just amazing detail, and this factors into the presence of airships at that time frame. And what a large airship this must have been. And how incredibly beautiful it would have been to be able to fly indefinitely over the skies. And yet we know for a fact in the 20th century that the reputation of the airship was utterly destroyed. The destruction of the Hindenburg is one of the first major events that was caught on video. And then if you see this other movie from the 1970s called Black Sunday, they showed a Goodyear blimp that was terrifying a Super Bowl crowd. Yes, it's a recurring theme. Airships are dangerous and deadly. You don't want to be around them because you could die or people close to you could die. And it's quite fascinating. And yet here we have a remarkable rendering of an airship from the late 18th century. Very beautiful. Now, this is where I could see more of the fantasy aspect if they wanted to try to push that narrative on what Lequeux was drawing here. But imagine if this was a real structure, what purpose this could have served. Could this have been some sort of power generation device or some other aspect of architecture that serves some function in society? And we also have to keep our minds open because there could have been many different ways of generating power. We know that power from the atmosphere is one of the most prevalent theories, but there could have been many other aspects. Technology beyond our ability to truly comprehend, because if after the last reset, it didn't have the apparatus that made it function, or whatever it used to convert into energy available, maybe there was some sort of different nature of the land at that time that we can't fully understand, but you still have these remaining pieces of technology. It's no doubt that they would have wanted to catalog that. And this is a very spectacular one, especially with how it's laid out. And you've never seen anything like this. I've never seen anything like this unless you go into really hardcore science fiction, which was no doubt inspired by these drawings. These drawings that we said were lost for a long time, and this individual that we said that we didn't know about for over 100 years. But then, of course, we rediscovered him like we seem to do other things. And then again, this building right here, looking more like an internal stadium or something else. And again, you see the cutaway in the cross section and the seating, and it's incredibly beautiful. And yet there's something about it that feels like it could be real, and it could have been real, because they want to tell us, well, no, this was a fantasy building. This was just somebody who was using their imagination, because apparently they had nothing better to do while the Napoleonic Wars were going on. And this was a great way to make a living. Look, I'm all about using your imagination, but it's fascinating when they try to push these narratives and these explanations. Then just a series of different design buildings from Lequeux. And again, you just see what looks to be like a bell structure here with a huge archway, and who knows how far that is or what the scale on this is actually supposed to be. And of course, they'd tell us, well, it's a very large building, and it's completely fantastical. There's no way that it could exist in reality. But then you look at this one here to the right, and you see more of things that are reflected in buildings and structures that we still have standing today that were supposedly built from this time frame. Like this structure right here looks like it could be something that you see in many castles and things that still endure to this day. And of course, we have a windmill, and we see plenty of windmills all over the place. So was this some sort of giant windmill, or was this a different application of wind technology? Of course, any of my viewers who are from northern Iowa, southern Minnesota, I saw that there were a lot of windmill farms there, and they didn't exactly have an aspect of beauty to them, but that's a discussion for another time. And then, of course, this building over here in the lower left corner, all this intricate detail. Again, you have the columns, and then you look at the roof or the ceiling together, and you see the detail that went into it and the remarkable display of geography. And this is just somebody going into this because they had a great imagination, and yet they captured this kind of detail. I don't know. I mean, to me, it reflects something that they were witnessing and recording, not something that they were imagining. But I could be wrong. That's just my impression of it looking at it. This is remarkable here because, we've seen towers like this, and this is something we typically associate with something you'd see in Spain. Or if you go to Country Club Plaza in Kansas City, you'll see something like it. But what I find interesting about this is you almost see like a bridge or something that reflects what they would traditionally tell us is an aqueduct. Again, with the columns and the pillars and the arches built in the ground. And then what is going on here? Is this some older structure potentially from before the reset? Is this depicting something else? I mean, just a remarkable rendering when you pull out all the detail. And again, you have these very, very fine symmetrical lines that, today they would tell us, well, that was just done by nature. It's erosion, it's magical glaciers, and more issues with wind. And then, of course, the flooding. And this was all underwater at one point in time. Of course, that's how they try to explain it now. But when you look at a drawing like this and you wonder if something like this really existed, and again, you see the aspect of it being in the ground, it definitely causes you to ask questions and really wonder about the buildings that are older that are still around to this day. And then this is an amazing building here, almost as though we have some sort of spiked outer shell on it. And then on the inside, very spherical. And who knows what exactly it's designed for. And what I find interesting is you have the signs of the zodiac around it. And then, of course, I'm reminded of walking around several state capitals, the Iowa state capitol, where they seem to have signs of the zodiac all over the place. So something that seemed to reflect more of a previous civilization than our own. Now, of course, we'll be told, well, that was the Roman civilization and Greek civilization. And then you ask questions about, okay, well, why is it in state capitol buildings that were supposedly designed and built in the United States in the 19th century? Well, because they wanted to reflect that Greek and Roman tradition of democracy. And no, the Romans were known for their tradition of democracy, especially when they had their architectural achievements. But that's all right. We can just say whatever we want to. And then this is an interesting one, and this is attributed to Lequeux as well, but here you're seeing a picture of what are clearly ruins, which of course they would tell us is from the Roman times, but then you have this amazing tower in the background. And again, to me, this seems to hint at the fact that they're not using their imagination. They're simply recording what they saw. And I think this picture, if it is indeed from that time frame, gives credence to that theory. But again, it could be that these pictures are truly someone's imagination or just a mix of many different artists. I fully accept that possibility as well. It's just remarkable to consider. And then some of the other images, and this is the big gate that we saw that's associated with Lequeux, and just amazing detail on it. All these different animals, and just imagine having a gate like this and what this is actually made out of, whether it's some form of concrete, sandstone, limestone, or some combination thereof that we can't understand, or it's just all marble, or it's 29 different types of marble, if you're following me on that one. And some of the images over here are pretty remarkable too. I mean, is he depicting something that was left standing after the reset? That's what these images give you an indication of. And then down here, just another amazing building that if this was a residence, just imagine having access to a residence like this with this kind of construction and this sort of durability and something that you know would endure for generations, if not more, of your family. And you can understand that if they had isolated structures like this in the lower right corner, why they had to destroy them. Now, supposedly a hotel right here, but seeing the cross section, of course, you have the classic dome building here and detailed stairways, and of course, replete with arches, columns, and pillars all over the place. And when you look at this cross section, this definitely reminds me of going into any one of the state capitals in the Midwest that I've been in recently. But it also reminds me of many other buildings that I've been in. And of course, we're just going to be told that, well, in the 19th century, we had the capability of doing this. But then on the same token, they want to tell us that, well, this was fantastical. These were all works of the imagination. And yet, what you see in the cross section of this building, you can see reflected in many buildings that still stand today. So which is it? Again, conflicting accounts as though we're told the question. And yet, when we just look at our own eyes, we see that what's depicted here in this building still exists today, reflected in many buildings that you can go to today. And another intriguing one with a cross section. And here you have even taller columns and just remarkable detail up here. And just look at this. You think of the Oculus and the Pantheon, and this reflects that. Now, looks like there's some wood structure in here, but again, it's just a drawing, so who knows what the rest of it's supposed to be made out of. Amazing chandeliers and stairways and remarkable detail. And here you have a smaller version of what's depicted over here, again with the same thing, and beautiful banister up here, and just amazing entryways and intricate detail. I don't know. This seems to reflect somebody recording what they saw. I know I keep saying that, but it's what I'm seeing in these drawings. I mean, in these drawings, if they're supposed to be technical drawings, then was he just using his technical capacity with his imagination to depict buildings that could never be built for fun? I don't know, maybe. I can't speak to his particular habits if this was one person who did exist, but just looking at all these buildings is breathtaking, and it's remarkable if it is just someone's imagination. But given the fact that we see so many connections to a lot of buildings that are still standing, I think there's a lot more to this story than we realize. And then this is more of a traditional building that you see standing up that reminds you of the Pantheon or the entryway or whatever. And the classic columns. And then, of course, you can still see statues like this on many monuments and buildings across the United States and Europe today. And of course, they'll say, well, this is a monument to World War I, or this is a monument to the United States Civil War. And then, of course, you have all these Roman and Greek figures, because if you really want to represent the United States Civil War or American democracy, you do so with Roman and Greek figures. And then another one, and a little bit of a smaller one, yet with the same design style. And again, there's nothing fantastical about these last two buildings that we're looking at, because you can find plenty of examples of these standing all over the world. So I don't know. It's as though they're intentionally trying to confuse us and get us to question everything, because some of the buildings, well, we can't explain. But these buildings can easily be explained, and you can find examples of them all over, even today. And then just a remarkable, what appears to be some sort of either monument or something else, but just the detail and fountain. And of course, we know how fountains are all over the place and what they could potentially represent. And here you see some ruin and some wreckage, and this particular rendering definitely gives credence to the theory that he was simply recording what he saw. And this is very beautiful. And again, we see some pillars and some arches. And again, just this kind of detail. Imagine what this would have taken to build and how they would have done it. And whether it was a prefabricated kit, because we see difference in scale, especially when it comes to columns and pillars. But just the detail that went in the statue. Of course, if this was still standing today, and let's just say this is in Des Moines, they'd probably say that this statue of this woman here represents Iowa, or maybe it represents Minnesota watching over Iowa. Anyways. And then again, some more interesting detail on the interior. And I picked this one because, again, you see this reference to what appears to be the sun. And then again, the smaller scale in the architecture on the interior, because I think it's important to look in the interior of these buildings, because that tells an entirely different story than what you see on the exterior. Imagine if this was in your living room and you had this kind of detail, and you wonder if this is one of the living room details that you saw in one of those amazing residences that Lequeux or whoever recorded when they were doing these renderings, or recorded, I should say. And then here it looks like you have what either appears to be a fountain or perhaps some other function that was still amalgamated with the ground, something from before the reset that they recorded. Hard to say, but it's very, very amazing. And you have the large blocks here. And of course, we still see examples of this all over as well today. Now let's explore our other architect, Etienne Louis Boully. Let's see what sort of account we get with this individual. Etienne Louis Boully was a visionary French neoclassical architect whose work greatly influenced contemporary architects. So this individual was not a visionary, he was a legitimate architect. Look, he even has a building, the Hotel Alexandre. Born in Paris, he studied under Jacques-François Blondeau, Germain Boulfrand, and Jean-Laurent Laguerre, from whom he learned the mainstream French classical architecture in the 17th and 18th century and the neoclassicism that evolved after the mid-century. He was elected to the Académie Royale d'Architecture in 1762 and became chief architect to Frederick II of Prussia, a largely honorary title. He designed a number of private houses from 1762 to 1778, though most of these no longer exist. Notable survivors into the modern era include the Hotel de Bruneuil, demolished in 1930, and the Hotel Alexandre, both in Paris. His work for François Racine de Monville has apparently also vanished, but his probable influence on Monville's own architectural works, as seen in the Desert des Rets, speaks for itself. Together with Claude Nicole Ledoux, he is one of the most influential figures of French neoclassical architecture. So it sounds like a very legitimate individual, and the account here makes it clear that he did exist. Geometric style. It was as a teacher and theorist at École Nationale des Ponts et Chaussées between 1778 and 1788 that Boully made his biggest impact, developing a distinctive abstract geometric style inspired by classical forms. His work was characterized by the removal of all unnecessary ornamentation, inflating geometric forms to a huge scale, and repeating elements such as columns in huge ranges. For Boully, regularity, symmetry, and variety were the golden rules of architecture. Now, how exactly do they know this? Are they just going off of his works? Did they talk to him? Do they have writings, recordings, accounts? Oh well, no matter. Cenotaph for Sir Isaac Newton. Boully promoted the idea of making architecture expressive of its purpose, a doctrine that his detractors termed architecture parlante, talking architecture, which was an essential element in Beaux Arts architectural training in the later 19th century. His style was most notably exemplified in his proposal for a cenotaph, a funerary monument celebrating a figure interred elsewhere, for the English scientist Isaac Newton, who 50 years after his death became a symbol of Enlightenment ideas. The building itself was 150 meters, 500 feet tall sphere, taller than the Great Pyramids of Giza, which, if we remember from our compilation of tallest buildings in the world in the Old World from 1886, this would have been taller than that, encompassed by two large barriers circled by hundreds of cypress trees. The massive and spheric shape of the building was inspired by Boully's own study called Theory of Bodies, where he claims that the most beautiful and perfect natural body is the sphere, which is the most prominent element of the Newton Memorial. Though the structure was never built, Boully had many ink and wash drawings engraved and circulated widely in the professional circles in 1784. The small sarcophagus for Newton is placed at the lower pole of the sphere. The design of the memorial is intended to create the effect of day and night. The night effect occurs when the sarcophagus is illuminated by the sunlight coming through the holes in the vaulting, giving the illusion of stars in the night sky. Intriguing. The day effect is an armorly sphere hanging in the center that gives off a mysterious glow. Thus, the use of light in the building's design causes the building's interior to change its appearance. And this was designed in 1784? Okay, whatever you say. And then we get accounts of the current standing buildings in the Hotel Alexander, which looks like it is still with us and you can still visit it. So let's look at his legacy. Boully's ideas had a major influence on his contemporaries, not least because of his role in teaching other important architects. Some of his work only saw light of day in the 20th century. Again, only saw light of day in the 20th century. His fondness for grandiose designs has caused him to be characterized as both a megalomaniac and a visionary. Oh, yes. Let's throw that in there. His focus on polarity, offsetting opposite design elements, and the use of light and shadow was highly innovative and continues to influence architects to this day. He was rediscovered, quote unquote, in the 20th century and has influenced recent architects. So, despite this seeming like a more legitimate individual according to the mainstream account, they still throw in those elements of doubt and then, of course, tell us it was rediscovered in the 20th century. What a surprise. Let's take a look at some of the works attributed to Boully beyond the cenotaph, shall we? Now let's take a look at Boully's work, and here we have what appears to just be a massive library with all these amazing books, and then of course you see what the article talked about with these many columns. And then of course the detail in the ceiling, and we have seen this before in other buildings, and this is just gorgeous. And of course they'll tell us, well, this is large, and basically the theme with Boully is bigger is better, and not just bigger, but mega structure, gargantuan compared to what we've seen. But imagine if this is really just a recording, a sketch that someone did on the inside of one of these tremendous buildings that did exist. Now, of course, we always come into the problem, well, if there were these really large buildings, how could they have destroyed them? And of course, you can find examples of that, such as with the City Hall in Philadelphia and many other examples across the world. But you have to wonder if something like this did exist, how inspiring it must have been, and if these were people coming back from a reset, how would they have ever explained this? So who knows? Who knows if these drawings or renderings are from a different time, or if it really is just an elaborate imagination. But we're told that Boully was more of a legitimate architect, and there's still an example of his work that survives today. He's not just a person who did nothing but drawings and renderings. So it's just very remarkable to consider the possibilities behind it. Now looking at this one, here you have what looks to be a very extremely large Capitol building, because right here you have people approaching it. And of course, we'll be told that this is a totally impossible structure, and this is just from Boully's imagination, and that this is showing examples of his megalomania, because if you have a big imagination, there must be something seriously wrong with you. If you're creative, there really must be something seriously wrong with you. So that seems to be a recurring theme that we get all the time. But I don't know. You look at this incredible image and this building, and not just its size and scope, but just the detail. And if we do go with the theory that there were kits, in other words, prefabricated kits that they used to construct these buildings, what was the limit on their scale? Was there any limit on their scale? Did the previous civilization, whatever it was called, whether it was Tartaria, Atlantis, or whatever, the name is irrelevant right now. But imagine if they had no limits to what they could prefabricate and what they could really build. Now, of course, we don't know what methods they used to build these buildings, but there are many buildings that we still don't know how they built. Take the pyramids in Giza, for example. Of course, we have many different theories. They used water and they floated the blocks into place, and that makes perfect sense. But there's other large megastructures around the world that we have no idea how they constructed. So just looking at something like this is just very inspiring, and yet you see reflections in modern buildings, in modern Capitol buildings, and buildings that they say have other purposes, whatever they want to say, across the world. And yeah, just imagine if something like this was something that could have been achieved. And this is definitely something you would have seen from miles on end. It wouldn't have even had to have been built up on a large hill, although for some reason these buildings today do seem to survive on large hills. And then, of course, here's an example of some of the other ones. And, of course, we always say he was only going to build tombs and mausoleums because that's what all these buildings are, tombs and mausoleums. But, again, you go with that whole concept of bigger is better. And just going back to the description of what Newton's cenotaph was supposed to be, if this was just imaginary, why would someone go to the trouble of designing something that was imaginary for what was supposed to be a legitimate tomb? I think that story just destroys itself when you just ask a few questions about it and think about it a little bit. If these were buildings that really existed, we can only speculate what their purpose was and what they could have been if there were these giant spherical buildings and that these weren't from someone's imagination. But it's interesting that we have two different architects that spherical buildings, perfectly spherical buildings, are attributed to. And down here we have more of a classical pyramid, along with something that we would say is yet another tomb or a mausoleum, because this looks like one of the wonders of the world. But nevertheless, it's remarkable considering the actual purposes of these buildings. And then here, something that I saw was listed as more of a classical opera house, but again, in scale, this looks like something that would be more achievable. So we're blurring the lines again. This doesn't seem like something that was beyond the colossal scale that they said that was impossible in that time frame, and yet we do have other colossal buildings that still survive to this day. So it's as though they just want to cloud the account and make us question it. But you see all these amazing, beautiful columns and all the detail, and then, of course, the statues across the top. And there are many monuments and buildings you can find examples of this to this day, and the size and scale is highly questionable. So I think in trying to discredit this, they're actually giving credit to the fact that these buildings could have actually existed. And then, of course, this cross section, and of course, we see the intricate detail on the ceiling, and then in some of the arches, and just an amazing cross section. And they just want to say, well, this is just somebody who loved to use lots of columns. Well, we see lots of columns all over the place on the interior and the exterior of buildings. And that's where you really get the surprise, is when you look in the interior of these buildings and you see columns like this standing all over the place. And here they are in the interior of this building. And again, looks like a nice, amazing dome structure. And go back and watch Palace in the Midwest if you want to see what this looks like today. It is still standing. And, of course, we'll say that this is an amazing tomb, although when you look up on tombs, you'll find oftentimes that these are not really any crypts that have anybody in them. They're just fake crypts. Interesting, isn't it? This is really a remarkable building. And this is where they're going to try to say that, okay, yes, this is his megalomaniacal tendencies taking hold here with all these columns, all these arches, and all this detail. There's no way this would have been possible. He was just trying to go outside of his mind and show something that was completely impossible. But what if he was either copying, or this is a drawing of some sort of building that did once stand? Just imagine how large that building would have been and how much material would have gone into it, and what would be remaining of it today if it was completely destroyed. We want to say that there is a limit to what can be accomplished, and yet when we look around us, we see evidence that there was something much more grand in scale and something beyond our imagination. And just seeing these drawings from this time frame that don't make a lot of sense from a legitimate architect. The other one, they just wanted to say, well, he used his imagination. And this one, they just want to say that he was a little crazy with imagination. And this is the result. I don't know. It's hard to say. And then, of course, going back to the example of the cenotaph, I mean, I don't know why you would get so far into designing something like this, something this extraordinary, for what was supposed to be a legitimate tomb. And of course, we can all go to that discussion of how many tombs we have all over the place. We can look at Grant's tomb in New York City, and you have many of the same details that they love to talk about with these tombs. And of course, this was a tomb that wasn't even ever built, it was merely imagined. And yet, you can find lots of different drawings of this particular one. And then some examples of some pyramids, because why not? You need to have some amazing large pyramids. And again, this goes back to reflecting that maybe they were simply recording what they saw. And I think there's a lot of evidence when we look at these pictures that that could well be the case, that in many situations they are recording what we saw, because there are many different accounts of even the pyramids at Giza. And then, of course, we have pyramids all over the world. Of course, we'll try to say that they're not pyramids, they're mounds, or they're something else, and they don't really reflect pyramids. But these drawings are very clearly pyramids and almost of a different type. And this pyramid below, again, you see the outer structure, which shows remarkable intricate detail above a series of columns going all the way around it. And then just look at the little doors. Just incredible. And then, of course, closing, I think we come down to this last image showing this remarkable type of pyramid with these huge obelisks around it. And we always get these accounts that Rome brought all these obelisks from Egypt and took them across the Mediterranean on ship, because that was an easy thing to do at that time as well, wasn't it? But just imagine if something like this did really exist, and what was really the size and scale and what went into it. And, well, this is something that you can justify by saying, there is a Great Pyramid in Giza that has this kind of scale. Well, it was built during the Bronze Age. That's what the mainstream account said. And they used water, or they used some other technology we don't understand. They didn't have wheels. They didn't need them. Some sort of tubular drill. All these theories, but no actual explanations. And if these are renderings that were real at one point in time, I don't think we have any actual explanations for how they could have been created. We can only speculate. Well, I hope you enjoyed this exploration of these renderings and these two supposed architects and this account. This clearly links to the old world, though, in just the types of buildings and the type of architecture that we see. And it's still reflected all over the world to this day in many buildings, as you can see. The only thing that's different is the scale, but there are many examples of the scale in what we believe are prefabricated kits, especially when we're talking about columns or pillars or arches. Well, remember, ask questions, explore yourself, you'll restore the world. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you for joining me today.